Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Robert. I am here to do another of the read-along videos. That's really all I've been able to keep up with in the last couple of weeks. For those of you that have seen my recent videos, this is yet another hotel. This is hotel number 2 in my transition stay. Tomorrow I'm headed to Atlanta for the Decatur Book Festival, so that'll be hotel number 3. And then when I get back, I'll be in hotel number 4 for, I hope, only a few more days. A quick update on my living conditions. I closed on my townhouse yesterday, so I now owe the bank a bunch of money. My movers will arrive with my boxes of books and clothes and pots and pans and things like that sometime after Labor Day. They won't even give me an exact date. That's how helpful they are. And this week, while I'm gone in Atlanta, and next week when I come back from Atlanta, my decorator is moving in the new purchases that we've made. And so I'm hoping it'll only be another 10 days, 2 weeks before I actually feel like I live in my new home. So it's getting closer. The big hurdle's done. The closing's finished. The house is built. Now it's just a matter of moving in. And that'll happen in stages. I'm not going to update you on everything that I've been reading because I haven't been able to keep up with Friday reads recently, but I have been reading quite a bit since all I'm doing is really sitting around in hotels. And so I'm going to skip that, but a quick update on where we are in the read-alongs. I've kind of given up on the idea of getting caught up on a schedule, and I'm just going to pick up from where we left off. So after this read-along, which is the one for Charles Dickens' Hard Times, we'll be shifting to the 20th Century Backlist, which the current read-along for that is Ann Tyler's Celestial Navigation. And then we'll go to the nonfiction selection after that, and that is Wendy Warren's, I think it's called New England Bound. That's what it is, New England Bound. Then when we get back to the 100 Essential Novels list, it's Robert Penn Warren's All the King's Men? Yeah, All the King's Men. And then I'm forgetting all the details. There's so much going on in my head right now. None of it's really constructive. And then when we get to the next 100 Great Books, which is what we're discussing today, I'll be picking up an Ernest Hemingway novel, For Whom the Bell Tolls, one I've read several times. In fact, I think I read it last year. But we'll be picking that one up again as the read-along for the 100 Great Books. Okay, so let's talk about Hard Times. Hard Times is probably the first Dickens novel that I ever studied as an undergraduate and then studied again as a graduate student and then taught it a couple of times and then hadn't read it for a number of years. So this is my first reread in a long time for this novel, and I've forgotten quite a few of the minor details, but they all kind of come together again now that I'm reading it. This book was first published in 1854, so right in the middle of the 19th century, and it was published as a serial, as most of the Victorian novels were, and was published in weekly installments. I don't know how long it took to publish the whole book, but every week some more chapters would come out. And a lot of Dickens' writing, especially the structure of his writing, was dictated by that serialization format. There's a theory of Dickens' writing called the streaky bacon theory, that he would mix up chapters with fat and lean as a way of keeping his readers always on the hook for what would come next. And it was a very effective strategy given the publishing techniques of the time. If you haven't read this book, it's one of Dickens' more political, or at least overtly critical of the politics of his society. It's one of his more political novels. It's right at the height of the Industrial Revolution, and he's, of course, attacking that. And so one of the really big ideas in this book is the idea of utilitarianism and his criticism of that practice. And it was a theory that goes back to the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham from 1748 to 1832 are the dates that I have for him. And it states that good is determined by one's usefulness to society and that one should strive for the maximum happiness of the greatest number. And it's a philosophy that's often debated in speech and debate. It comes up in a lot of the debate rounds. Dickens rejects this theory completely as mindless because it's based only on factual things. And there's no concern for happiness. There's no concern for imagination. There's no concern for what he would call fancy. And you see that in the school of Thomas Gradgrind. He develops a school that teaches nothing but the facts, and it completely ignores humanity. And his daughter Louisa is probably the biggest result of that. She grows up to be basically feelingless, and she lets things happen that she wouldn't have let happen otherwise. And it's not until the end of the book that she actually becomes awakened to the idea that feelings matter. And of course, her father realizes it too late too. Dickens is criticizing these societies in which utilitarian pursuits were considered more important than the emotional or the spiritual or the moral values of the people in the society. Utilitarianism is stressing the idea that machines bring maximum happiness because they create the most goods with the fewest number of people. They lessen the workload, but that wasn't always a good thing either. Dickens worried that intangible things were getting lost in this society. Love, imagination, artistic expression, all these things are derided by the utilitarian outlook as unnecessary, fanciful imagination. If you look at that, of course, the prime example in this book is Mr. Bounderby. He is the symbol of utilitarianism. And Gradgrind initially is part of that syndrome as well, as his school develops in the students. They don't have any use for the things that we consider human. And you see that especially in a character like Bitzer, who just follows rational logic in the face of everything else, even his own possible benefit. He doesn't believe in that if it violates the idea of reason. So he's really attacking utilitarianism. He's also talking about labor unions. And a lot of critics argue that Dickens was anti-union, since he gives kind of an unflattering portrait of the union labor leader in this book, Slackbridge. But Dickens was an avid supporter of labor unions as long as three conditions were met. One, that labor protests should take place within the legal structure of society and not violate the law or cause physical damage or violence. Two, that strikes were to be used only as a last resort when all other measures had failed. And three, that union leaders must be devoted to the well-being of the workers, not to their own selfish interests. And of course, that's where most unions get in trouble, is that corruption sneaks in and it's not really the workers' interests that are being taken care of. It's rather the leaders enriching themselves. And so Dickens is criticizing Slackbridge because the union organizer has no concern really for the workers' genuine needs, and he exploits the workers for his own selfish desires for power. And so Dickens was a great supporter of these kinds of measures that would protect workers and to make their lives more fulfilled. And that's not what's going on in this particular book. He warned the government that rebellion ultimately is going to occur if the workers weren't more fairly treated. And he gives a pretty moving portrait of the laborer, Stephen Blackpool, who becomes the victim of this system. And his life is ruined and ultimately lost because of the brutal labor practices that we see in this society. And so Dickens advocates the golden rule throughout this book: do unto others, that's really the way he looks at society. And of course, Sissy Jupe is the character that seems to embody this intuitively. She doesn't study to think like this. She just embodies these natural, wholesome qualities. And that's the best guideline that Dickens thinks that should govern the relationship between labor and management. Another big topic that shows up in this book, and he talks about this in a number of his books, and that's the idea of the mistreated child. Downtrodden, easy for me to say, downtrodden children are often used to arouse our emotions as readers and hopefully move the government to social reform. You have Sissy Jupe's abuse at Gradgrind School, and the emptiness of Louisa's and Tom's childhoods because of the warping influence of this idea of factual education. And that kind of emphasizes the evils of this utilitarian approach that you see throughout the book. Dickens is regarding the English government as the ultimate bad parent, and that the country citizens are the ultimately mistreated children of that time. Another idea in this book that I think is important is the idea of marriage and divorce. There are lots of bad marriages in the novel. The Gradgrind's marriage is kind of disastrous. The Blackpools, Bounderby and Louisa's marriage is terrible. And Dickens highlights Stephen Blackpool's predicament of having no legal means of escape from his wretched marriage to who has become a drunk and violent wife. She's basically plagued his adult life. And in Dickens' time, it was only the very wealthy who could obtain an act of parliament that was required to negate a marriage. And so people who were poor, like Stephen Blackpool, literally had no option. They were stuck. And Dickens had a personal stake in trying to change some of these archaic laws. While he was writing this novel, his own marriage was deteriorating quickly, and 4 years later he separated from his wife, even though he was not able to obtain a divorce either. So that was an issue that was becoming important to him at the time. I'm not going to spend any time on this particular book with symbols, other than the fact that so many of the names in Dickens' novels are symbolic. The idea of Gradgrind and the grind of just learning monotonous facts by rote, that kind of thing. Bounderby's name kind of reflects his attempt to rise up from the lowest levels of society and leap over all these different levels of social boundaries and become someone that he's really not. The head of the school, Machokum Child. You can't get much more devastating than that, Machokum Child. Even Mrs. Sparsit, who is kind of Mr. Bounderby's live-in dependent, the fact that, you know, she doesn't have any money, funds are sparse with her, and so she lacks any social position, even though she feels like she's high-born, that kind of thing. And of course, you've got the biblical name of Stephen Blackpool's love interest, Rachel, as someone who's very pure. Even Sissy Jupe, in a way, she's very full of life, and her short last name, with its sound effect, reflects that vitality. So there's a lot going on in this book in terms of social conventions and in terms of criticism of utilitarianism and the society. And this comes at a time that the Industrial Revolution was really taking hold of economic structures in England and Europe. It was a period of social and economic changes that grew out of this mechanization of the factory and production processes. And we still see the holdover effects today, even in education. It's often remarked that we still build schools on a factory model. We batch children by the year they were born, rather than any other identifying factor like talent or interest or anything like that. The factory bells ring in between periods. When they run to the bathroom, we still have separate bathroom facilities, things like that. So the factory model has dominated for us. The origins of this in England are around 1760, and the Industrial Revolution's effects were so widespread by the time of the action in Hard Times that Dickens uses this novel as his vehicle for attacking practices in the society that he sees as ultimately soulless and individual destroying. There's another idea in this book about fact versus fancy. And Dickens doesn't state in Hard Times that people are either fact oriented or fancy oriented, but he urges people to exercise their imaginations, even if they're in a fact driven world. I ran into this a lot in higher education, that a lot of people wanted to specialize in technical fields and saw no reason to read literature or to spend time analyzing texts and how they were put together as arguments and things like that. But I found in the actual work world that if you knew how to communicate well, you could learn a technical field as an addition to that and go into a technical field. But if you only studied the technical field and never learned how to communicate, you had a huge limit on your advancement in whatever profession it was. When I went into finance, I went in without a finance degree. I learned the technical aspects because I was ultimately hired as a communicator, as a writer, and as an editor. And the technical parts of it were easier to acquire than the reverse. If I had just studied finance and had no idea how to communicate, I'd have been much worse off. So that's something that he's often talking about in this book. He does kind of assume that the economic theory that was popular in Dickens' time, laissez-faire economics, which literally means to leave alone, that it kind of advocates the non-interference of government in business. And we're seeing that again now. I mean, with all the rollbacks and regulations that the current administration is doing in the United States, there's this idea that we need to get out of the way of business, and everybody is benefited from that. But we've seen time and time again that that's not the way it works. So all these different things that he's talking about here, Dickens is indirectly speaking out against this idea of rolling back regulations and laissez-faire economics, because the lack of governmental restraints allows owners like Bounderby and like corporations today to exploit workers, the environment, the tax codes, mercilessly, and provides no compensation for the actual workers. The whole idea with the recent, and I don't mean for this to get too political, but it's a perfect economic example. The whole idea behind the recent American tax cuts was that it would end up being increases in workers' salaries. But that's not what's actually happened. The money that these corporations have saved has gone towards stock buybacks, which enrich the owners, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but that tax cut was sold on the idea that it would make everybody working for the corporations better off, and that simply has not been the case, and it's not ever the case. Trickle-down economics has never worked. And so Dickens is attacking that in this book. So this is becoming, once again, a book for our times. And then there's a phrase that Stephen Blackpool uses when he's talking about his legal inability to get a divorce. And he keeps saying, "'Tis a muddle. It's all a muddle. 'Tis a muddle." And that kind of characterizes Dickens' own attitude toward this new industrialism in England. Blackpool never really understood why his situation was so hopeless. And even though the phrase indicates that these things are beyond his comprehension, Dickens believed that the country's enormous wealth, which was derived, of course, from the British Empire at the time, and the social irresponsibility that goes along with this laissez-faire economics, that goes hand in hand with the Industrial Revolution, had undermined the old values, things like charity and decency toward other people, and he sees it as a cheapening of the society. For Dickens, the result was that England's moral situation as a world leader was in a muddle, and it was muddled by greed, it was muddled by smugness, it was muddled by relentless competition and an indifference to the plight of most of its citizens. So this book, I think, is one that's become relevant in the United States all over again, like it was relevant in the 19th century in England, because we're at a period where we're acting on these very same economic principles, and we're seeing exactly the same results that Dickens was bemoaning in Hard Times. It seems a little different from some of the other Dickens books I've read, because it's a story about individual people, but it's really got the bigger intent of attacking society. In a lot of his other books, there's that undercurrent of criticizing society, but the focus is more on the individual stories in those books. And I think that focus switches just a little bit for Dickens in this particular book. So, if you've read Hard Times, let me know what you think of it in the comments, and if you're looking forward to it, you should pick it up. I think it's a wonderful book. It's I'm not sure if it's one of my favorites of Dickens, but it's one that I certainly seem drawn to reread over the years a number of times. So coming up next, I've started Ann Tyler's Celestial Navigation. I've only read the first 40 pages or so, but I'll be reading that over the course of the next week. I don't know how much reading I'm going to get done while I'm at the Decatur Book Festival. I imagine we're going to be going to as many sessions as we can go to, and I won't have just hours and hours of sitting there reading time, although I will have the drive to and from Atlanta to at least listen to something on tape. And then after that, we go into the nonfiction with New England Bound. And then, as I said, when we get back to the 100 Essential Novels, we'll do All the King's Men by Robert Penn Warren. And the next of the 100 Great Books we'll do is a Hemingway title, For Whom the Bell Tolls. So I hope you're having a great week. And I'm not sure if I'm going to blog or vlog while I'm in Atlanta. I'm not really very good at that yet. Although now that I have an iPhone with a pretty good camera, it might be worth giving that a shot. We'll see. But I'll definitely be checking in early next week, if not with a vlog, at least with an update on what's going on, how Atlanta went, and things like that. So I'll talk to you again very soon. Bye, everybody.